Greenlight made a lot of IndyCar diecasts this year, so we're going to take a look at all 20 of the different car and team combinations that they have made so far this year in the order that they finished, DNF'd, or didn't even qualify for this year's Indianapolis 500. Let's get into it. The man who stole all of the month of May headlines for all of the wrong reasons, James Hinchcliffe, missed the show, getting bumped essentially 35th, though he didn't actually have a posted qualifying time because he withdrew his time only to have a tire pressure sensor start rattling around loose in one of the wheels, created vibration, made James uncomfortable in the cockpit enough that he had to pull in, and then for a variety of circumstances did not get another shot to qualify for the 102nd running of the Indianapolis 500, and thus Hinchcliffe was out. Now, there was a lot of talk, a lot of controversy in the week leading up to the Indianapolis 500 of whether or not he would buy his way into the field, whether or not IndyCar made a huge mistake in allowing bump day in the first place because, oh no, one of the stars didn't make the show. But the longer time racing fans, or maybe some of the hardcore people, said exactly that is the point. That's why bump day is bump day, because nobody is safe, and I would argue that Hinchcliffe created more attention and more ticket sales for the 500 just due to all of the controversy surrounding his exit from the 500 before he even got a shot at it. A little bit of a problem with this diecast. You've got I've got a front wing that's a bit wonky. I'm usually very discerning with my diecast buying, but for whatever reason, this slipped past me. It looks like that rivet is pretty riveted in there, and unless I can figure out a way to unscrew that and get the wing readjusted, my Hinchcliffe car is going to kind of be a bit of a microcosm of his month of May. But Hinch's car isn't the only bumped car we got this year from Greenlight. Pippa Mann's number 63 holds a unique place in diecast history. As far as I can tell, or attest, or whatever word you want to use, this is the first official bumped car that's ever been made. It's of course got the official Indy 500 red wall tires, and this scheme and car and driver combination is not scheduled to race in any other Verizon IndyCar Series races this season. Therefore, the Donate Life number 63 car from this year is the first bump day special ever to be made. And it's a bit of a shame too, because it's a pretty interesting livery on this car. Definitely pops. It's definitely a different color combination. Definitely gives off an Easter Bunny vibe. But yeah, again, just Pippa missed it, and it was weird because a lot of people, myself included, didn't really actually think she would miss it at the end of the day. Of course, Dale Racing has shown a lot of speed, and if you look at least Bourdais and Zachary Clayman DeMello's pace, you would think that they could just strap a setup on Pippa's car and be good to go, but that was not the case. Pippa just never really had the speed, missed the show, and she will always have the space of being the first alternate qualifier for the 102nd running of the Indy 500. One of the reasons the Indianapolis 500 is considered the greatest race in the world is because it can go from the penthouse to the outhouse in 1 year. Case in point, Takuma Sato. 32nd place finish after contact with the lap car of James Davison put him out of the race. And again, that's just kind of the nature of the beast at Indianapolis. Defending winners generally do not have a great follow-up to their Indy 500 win, and unfortunately Takuma Sato got bit by that bug. Beautiful car though. Greenlight did a fantastic job, and so did the livery designer on the Rahal Letterman Lanigan team. It's just a fantastic looking livery, as attested to the fact that I bought the full 118 version of this car. I don't know what it is. I think it's the fact that some of the black hides some of the less particularly good looking parts of the Universal Aero kit, though there are much fewer than there were last year. It's just a lovely car, and props to Greenlight for doing the half and half rims both on the 164 and the 118. That's a detail that's been missing for quite a few years, despite the fact that several teams use that rim style, or at least rim coloring style. They haven't really replicated it on many diecast recently, but again, an absolutely lovely car, and just a shame for Takuma Sato. Kind of an innocent bystander, though I kind of blame the spotter more than I do, or spotter for Sato than I do James Davison, but that's a whole nother debate that we already covered in the IndyCar Red Pill. Boy, oh boy, it didn't pay to do well in last year's Indy 500. The next driver up is the third-place finisher from last year's Indy 500, Ed Jones. Of course, at that point, he was driving for Dale Coyne Racing, and this year driving for Ganassi, which is even more of a shock, that he just was not very competitive the whole month of May. And then it ended very early on in the turn 2 wall, the treacherous turn 2 wall that took out many experienced drivers this year and even last year, if you think about it. Just Ed Jones. It's so weird because he overperformed in a car that maybe he shouldn't have performed so well in. Then he gets the big call up to the big team. The number 10, of course, has won the Indy 500 several times, and yet Ed Jones just really wasn't there this year. Hopefully he doesn't get Darren Manninged, though I'm a little bit worried he will going into maybe even the end of this year, maybe the beginning of next year. But we'll have to see. Chip is a bit fickle sometimes, so you never know exactly what he's going to do, but hopefully Ed Jones gets another shot because I believe he is a very talented driver, just having a sophomore slump. Danica Patrick certainly went out with a bang in her final race, but I don't think it was the bang that she, her fans, or even people who are observers like me really wanted to see. It was a crash in the turn 2 wall that took Danica Patrick out of the Indy 500, but it's interesting to note that in her Indy 500 career, that was the first time she'd ever made wall contact on her own. Now, she did DNF the 2008 Indy 500, but that was contact with Ryan Briscoe in the pit lane, and it wasn't really her fault, all memes aside. So, yeah, it's a bit of a shame that it ended that way. I'm not convinced that that was her last Indy 500 or last race, but some people, including Danica herself, are quite, I think, satisfied with her career as it is now, and we'll see where Danica Patrick ends up in the next couple of years. But again, I just hazard a guess that that couldn't have possibly been the end, but who knows. Yeah, it was a bit of a shame, but Danica did have a good career. She's been influential in the sport, and certainly, if this is goodbye for Danica, I hope she enjoys her retirement and, starts a family or whatever she's interested in doing. And I guess we'll see her at an autograph session sometime, right? When they have the legends come back for the Indy 500? Nah, probably not. There's either one of two things. She's either going to be very visible in the racing community, or we'll never ever see her again. And I'm kind of starting to lean toward we'll never ever see her again. But who knows? Speaking of fan-favorite drivers who kind of disappointed, Tony Kanaan ended his day with a crash in turn 2, kind of like Jones and Danica and several other drivers. But the interesting thing about Tony, or the fun thing about Tony this year, was that he was very, very competitive in an AJ Foyt car, leading the 500, and that was just such a cool moment. It seemed like he may have been the only driver who could have possibly challenged power towards the end of the race. You got to think on that last restart, which of course he himself brought out the yellow for, so maybe that restart wouldn't have happened in the first place. But Tony is definitely a crazy guy on the restarts, and you got to think he probably at least would have challenged power, maybe a little bit more than Ed Carpenter did. It just seemed like Ed wasn't very fast on the restarts. And certainly Tony was dynamite on the restarts, taking the lead at least twice on a couple of restarts, and really was pulling away from Carpenter towards the midway point in the race. He just had a tire puncture right at halfway, and then was mired back in traffic and really never got another shot to go up to the front. Kind of unfortunate, and certainly I think a lot of the fans, myself included, were kind of thinking, man, how cool would it be for Tony to get one for AJ, but it didn't work out this year. But as far as AJ is concerned, Tony can come back as many years as he'd like to try for AJ Foyt Racing. So I guess that's good job security for TK. And certainly I think a lot of fans are going to be very excited to see this partnership continue for years to come. Zack Beech was a driver who received a no nickname throughout the month of May. It started out as Zack and Cheetos due to the fact that, well, he wasn't running this livery at the Indy 500. He was running a relay livery, which is like a credit card or something, part of Group 1001, which for some reason 1001 is a insurance company, and yet they have a credit card. Oh, that sounds a bit scummy, but never mind. Zack and Cheetos, because it was bright orange and bright yellow. And then, unfortunately, during the race, Zack caught on fire, and then he became flaming hot Zack and Cheetos. That was a bit disappointing. Yeah, Beech is one of those guys that I'd like to see succeed. I think a lot of people are pulling for him. Certainly the story about his bullying, I think, or the fact that he was bullied, not his bullying, the fact that he was bullied kind of resonates with a lot of folks, and I think a lot of folks are cheering for him. He certainly has seemed to step up to the plate, certainly at Andretti Autosport. There's a lot of pressure. And certainly the number, not sure if it's the exact chassis, but the team that he was driving for this year won it last year with Takuma Sato, so yeah, that was a lot of pressure for him. He didn't quite perform, but again, he's got a 3-year contract, and Group 1001 seems to be pretty strongly behind him. So I think we'll see Zack Beech continue to improve over the next few years, and he'll probably be a race-winning contender one of these days. It just wasn't his race this year. Kind of continuing the trend of drivers who didn't really perform as well this year as they did last year is Max Chilton. Of course, there's a bit of an excuse because he had a brand new team, Carlin Racing, but he led the most laps in last year's Indianapolis 500 and was one of the first drivers to get lapped in this year's Indianapolis 500. But credit to Chilton, he kept the car in the show all day long and didn't wall it or anything, and that I think is something that Carlin Racing particularly wanted from this Indy 500, wanted to bring both of their cars home in one piece. They managed to do that. Now, an interesting thing about this diecast is the fact that it's on completely the wrong livery, and there's a bit of a funny story that was uncovered by my pal Race Day 2011 when he asked Max Chilton about it, and Max Chilton said to the extent of, it's on the wrong bloody livery because somebody made a fantasy paint scheme for him, and somehow Greenlight decided to put the fantasy livery on the diecast, and somehow that made it past quality control. It somehow got approved, and this is how we've ended up with this car. You can tell it's a fantasy livery because of the fact the 59 is on this little flick in front of the rear wheel pod, or the rear wheel. There's no rear wheel pod anymore. A lot of people thought this was how the number was going to look this year, but they've actually put the number on the rear wing. Of course, a lot of people have complained about that as well. Yeah, we got a fantasy livery for Max Chilton. Now, I bought it in 164, A, because, I wanted all the drivers, but B, it doesn't really particularly look all that much different from the official race livery if you squint at it, and certainly at 164 scale, it's a lot less obvious than at 118 scale. Here's one of the month of May's great stories. Conor Daly coming back after being unceremoniously let go from the A.J. Foyt team last year to put together a partnership with Dale Coyne Racing and Tom Burns. Of course, Tom Burns used to help the Laziers out quite a bit in getting to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but decided to go with Conor Daly this year in the United States Air Force as a primary sponsor, but this car was not very fast throughout the month of May. It seemed almost certain that Conor was going to get bumped, and then he pretty heroically put the car in the show pretty solidly as well. He would not have been the next he would not have been the next bump, I should say. James Davison was actually on the bubble at the end of the day. So he did a fantastic job to get the car in the show and then ran all day long. Yeah, he sure did lose a lap, but he just drove a really solid race. He didn't put it in the wall. He didn't put a wheel wrong. And that's what you have to expect as a driver who is not necessarily in a race-winning car. I think it was an admirable performance from Conor Daly, and certainly one that, again, kind of proves that he belongs for sure. Now, people kind of wondered why we got a diecast of this particular car. It seemed a bit odd, especially considering kind of the odd partnership between Dale Coyne Racing and Tom Burns. But Conor was voted the most popular driver in the series last year. Some people kind of forget or just don't know that even happened, but it did. So I suspect even if Conor missed the show, they were going to make this diecast anyway because the fans voted him the most popular driver. That title was held by Helio Castroneves for several years, and it's kind of ironic that Castroneves in his final year did not win the most popular driver. It was Conor Daly. But hopefully Daly has earned himself a couple more opportunities because, again, I felt like this effort was really strong from him. It was pretty cool to get both cars from Carlin Racing this year. A new team getting two diecasts is almost unheard of, but that's what happened because, of course, Charlie Kimball and Max Chilton both, I think, they kind of like their diecast, so it was kind of cool to get this. Now, what's interesting about this is it's kind of the traditional Tricibia livery that we've seen with Ganassi the last couple of years. Of course, he didn't run this in the race. He ran Faispeep or something like that. Now, I remember how Bob Jenkins pronounced it, and I think that was close to how Bob Jenkins pronounced it, so that's how I'll pronounce it. But this is the full season livery for Charlie Kimball, so yeah, that's the one we got. I don't think they were really particularly made aware that there was going to be an Indy 500 special livery, but though Charlie Kimball seems to run those more often than not. Kimball had a pretty anonymous race, no doubt about it. He qualified very well, actually. It was kind of an impressive run from the brand new team for Carlin, but it seems like they missed the race setup quite a bit. Both Kimball and Chilton, who, if you'll remember, were both race-winning contenders last year, really couldn't get a lot out of the cars for this year. I think the next couple years, Carlin Racing will grow into a much bigger and much more competitive organization. I think they're doing it the right way, and it'll be interesting to see how they get on. And though there's a lot of people who aren't necessarily the biggest fans of Kimball or Chilton, I think they're solid drivers, and they're good drivers to give a nice foundation to a brand new team. Speaking of impressive debuts, Matthias Leist, he finished the race, drove a very smart race. In fact, drove an entire month of May that was very smart. Outlasted both of his veteran teammates, Tony Kanaan and James Davison, in the race. He was the only Foyt car that didn't end up in the fence. So you have to almost think that, dang, what an impressive debut. I hope that people make a little bit more noise about this than really has been made. Yeah, sure, he didn't lead the race. He was never really in contention for victory. But in your first Indy 500, you're not really expected to do that. I think a lot of people were kind of expecting the opposite from Matthias Leist, that he would send it on the first lap and possibly end up in the wall. But no, it was a very, very solid performance from him. And I think he'll impress. Hopefully he sticks around because, of course, he did win the Freedom 100. He dominated that race last year in a race that, as we saw this year, is incredibly, incredibly competitive. So who knows down the line? Hopefully Leist sticks around and we get to see more of him because he was definitely impressive on debut. Also, thanks to my friend Race Day 2011 for getting me this car. It was fairly scarce at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, so I'm glad I was able to get it, add it to the collection, and add it to this video because it would have been slightly incomplete if Leist hadn't been there. Well, you knew this was coming eventually. We finally get to talk about Marco Andretti and the fact that he was fast all month and gets to the race day and was pretty much anonymous throughout it. Very strange. It's just, I don't get Marco. It's just, there need to be books written about Marco because I just don't understand how somebody can be so fast throughout most of the month of May, look like he's got the car to win. Then you get to the race and he's just really not there. I just don't understand it. Maybe they missed the setup. It's a weird thing with Marco. It's so weird. The U.S. Concrete car, though, that Marco drives definitely looks nice. I wasn't particularly impressed with the livery when they revealed it, and yet when I saw it in person, and I've seen it in diecast form now, obviously, I kind of really like it. Gives me Newman Haas vibes, big-time Newman Haas vibes, which is kind of funny because he actually at Phoenix ran a Newman Haas throwback. But yeah, it's a nice-looking car. It's definitely nice to see a lot of sponsorship on the car. Snapple is still there, as well as Oberto, U.S. Concrete, all these fairly big sponsors. And it definitely tells you why Marco's still around. It's not necessarily just because of his dad owning the team, though that's a big part of it. It's also because the Andretti name sells sponsorship. And it certainly generates a lot of interest in the race when he's running up front, as we saw with Detroit when he qualified on the pole. Everybody was suddenly on the Marco hype bandwagon, despite the fact that many people have kind of been detractors of Marco, if you could say that for sure. Speaking of second-generation race car drivers driving for daddy, we're talking about Graham Rahal, and we've actually moved up into the top 10 in terms of the actual race results. Rahal managed to bring the car home 10th after starting 30th position, starting in 30th position. Easy for me to say. This is a beautiful car, no doubt about it. One of my favorite liveries. Certainly the Rahal team really hit it out of the park with their liveries this year. And Graham really struggled this Indianapolis 500 to get speed. It seemed like the Rahal team was just in trouble. They got all three of their cars in the race, and then once the race actually started, they were quite competitive. So it was nice to see them be able to kind of claw their way back from the brink, I guess you could say, in terms of worrying whether or not they'd even make the race. Then it was like, well, are they going to be able to be competitive? And they were. Serbia led the race. Rahal, I believe, led it a couple times on fuel strategy. They didn't quite have the pace to win the race, but I don't think that was expected of them, though maybe their personal expectations were to win the race. An interesting thing about the Rahal team is they're actually in talks to house the McLaren program for next year, and presumably that would include Fernando Alonso. So it'll be interesting to see where this all leads and whether or not their performance during the month of May was either a deterrent to that program or possibly maybe their resilience will help them get to it. But Graham Rahal drove a really good race. Now we get to talk about the champ, Josef Newgarden, car number 1, Verizon. Yeah, didn't quite have the best Indy 500. Again, I think I said it in the Bandwagoners Guide. He's on and he's off at Indianapolis, and this was an off year for Josef Newgarden. Just wasn't quite there, which is weird because at the beginning of the race he was there. In the lap traffic, he'd actually gotten up to second place and was challenging Carpenter for the lead, and then he just kind of fell off. And he really never recovered quite the way his teammates did, at least in terms of running up near the front. Even Simon Pagenaud was up in the top 3 most of the day, and Newgarden just wasn't. It's weird. It seems like the Indy 500 may be his bugaboo, I guess you could say. These Verizon cars, too. There were 3 of them at the IndyCar Grand Prix. I guess we're thankful that there was only 2 of them in this year's Indy 500, because boy, oh boy, were they hard to tell apart. They actually had to change the number on this car. As you can see, it's a black number outlined in Marlboro red. Well, they flip-flopped that for the race, and it was a Marlboro red number 1 with black outline, and that helped a little bit, but the problem was the other Verizon car also had a red number, so it didn't really change things all that much. But yeah, Josef Newgarden, IndyCar champion, and just not quite a champion of the 500 yet. Just not quite there in terms of his driving or his 500-mile talent. I'm not sure what it exactly is that's keeping him out of victory lane, but certainly something is. Those of us who are nostalgic certainly have a soft spot in our hearts for this car, the Menards 22 for Simon Pagenaud. Absolutely lovely, lovely color on this car. The Menards Day Glow Yellow is just such a nice color. And it's always nice when Greenlight gets it right. Simon Pagenaud actually had a pretty good race day. He certainly qualified well. Second place, almost had the pole, if not for Ed Carpenter's heroics on pole day with the 230-mile-an-hour lap that absolutely nobody was going to touch. It seems like Simon's going to be an Indy 500 winner one of these days. It almost feels like an inevitability, especially considering the team he runs for. But at the same time, it just seems like when it's crunch time, he's not quite there. Now, he was in 2015, which is kind of interesting because that was his first year with Penske, and he was very, very competitive. If it wasn't for a front wing failure on one of the restarts, he may have been up there and contending with Montoya and Power for the win. But at the same time, this year's Indy 500, it just seemed like he got outraced, especially by some of the guys that we'll be talking about here in just a second, because, of course, he started second and ended up finishing like 6th or 7th. I've got the results here. I could actually look at those, but screw it. We'll just go off of the cuff on this one. But yeah. Pagenaud, he probably will win an Indy 500 someday, but it may not be in the near future. It just seems like there's always somebody who outraces him at the Indy 500, but you never know. The grass is green, the sky is blue, and Ryan HunterReay is competitive at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Once again, just a solid drive from the 2014 winner. One of these days he's going to get a second win. I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but boy, oh boy, does he really probably deserve one. Ryan HunterReay, one of the better drivers at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and really, frankly, in 500-mile races, if you've looked at his performance at Pocono the last couple of years. It's kind of weird, again, just another driver that just doesn't seem to be able to get the luck to slide his way. I guess he's thankful that he got one Indy 500 win, but at least the car stayed under him this year. He probably would have gone to dominant victories in both 16 and 17 had he actually had the cars stay underneath him. Unfortunately, a crash in pit lane in 16 and a A blown engine in 17 kept him out of victory circle both of those years. This year, it was just the car wasn't quite as competitive. It seemed like he could get up to about 4th place, and then he stalled out. He ended up finishing 5th because of Alexander Rossi and his moxie, to use a better term. But yeah, I think we'll see Ryan HunterReay in victory circle. It's a matter of if, not when, again. And since I mentioned him, Alexander Rossi. What a story this was. Coming from 32nd place on the grid all the way up at one point to 3rd place. Yeah, and he did it on passing in a race that theoretically, and a lot of people said you couldn't pass. Oh, you can't pass with these Universal Aero kits. It's impossible. And Alexander Rossi proved that wrong on some of those restarts were Thomas Scheckter level crazy. But the 2016 Indy 500 winner, if there was any doubt after the last couple years he had at the Indy 500, he's one of the better Indy 500 drivers. He's one of the better drivers at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and frankly, he's one of the better drivers in the series. Rossi hopefully will stick around for a while. Hopefully he doesn't get called to F1, because I think he would take the opportunity if the opportunity was good enough. But man, oh man, it's just Rossi just really proved on this day, the Indianapolis 500, that he was the top, or one of the top dogs. And just, it's interesting, though, about the diecast real quick. Yeah, the Napa logo is definitely a bit screwy on the side there. Not sure what's going on, or why they can't print over the side pod, which is like that. But he also ran a patriotic livery, kind of similar to something that you would see in NASCAR. And, of course, you did see it in NASCAR because Chase Elliott ran a similar one. Don't know if we'll ever get that diecast. I would definitely buy it in 118 if they did it, though, because I am a big fan of Rossi personally, and again, I think he's one of the most talented guys that's come into IndyCar racing in a very long time. Speaking of talented guys in IndyCar racing, Scott Dixon. What a month of May for him. They managed in both Indianapolis races, the Grand Prix and the Indianapolis 500, to put a car that wasn't necessarily as competitive as his contemporaries or his competitors into the top 3. And Scott Dixon, just what a brilliant race and what a brilliant strategy from Mike Hull. They brought him in with 40 laps to go. They topped him off with fuel. He did some fuel saving. They got the yellow they wanted, and then they raced from there on to 3rd place. It was just a really, really Scott Dixon-y day at the 500. And if he had caught a few breaks, he might have been in the winner's circle, and that would have been even more spectacular, especially with new sponsor PNC Bank. Boy, is it nice to get a Dixon diecast after having to wait a full year to get one. And it does look very nice, no doubt about it, though there is a problem. And you may have already noticed it and possibly even pointed it out in the comments already. Why are there black rims on this car? The primary Ganassi cars never run black rims, as evidenced by Ed Jones. Those are silver rims. Those are what they run. Who greenlit this? Pun intended. Why? Why? Silver rims. Ganassi runs silver rims. Period. Anyway. The local favorite, Ed Carpenter. Man, what a story he did. Or what a story he had. Or what a story he was during the month of May. A 230-mile-an-hour lap in qualifying. Nobody thought that was possible. Nobody thought, well, maybe a few people thought that was possible. But yeah, by himself doing a 230-mile-an-hour lap in this configuration of the DW12 chassis is absolutely stellar. It just seemed like Ed, again, I predicted it. I kind of said, the Ed Carpenter cars are going to fade. Well, he faded to 2nd. And I can't say that that's a bad result, and I even think Ed himself would tell you it wasn't a bad result. But at the same time, man, oh man, he just didn't have it for willpower. He drove a brilliant race, easily his best 500 he's ever driven to get 2nd. But again, he just had nothing for willpower. Fun note about this diecast, you'll notice it is Fuzzy's Vodka sponsored, and yet it has no base or anything. It's just a regular diecast. The only difference on the packaging is it says 21 plus on it. And what's funny is the scale you would think is a kid's scale gets made for the Fuzzy's car, but there is no 118 available of this model. I have no idea why. It's a bit strange, but this is the world we live in. At the very least, it's a good-looking car. I'm glad they kind of went with the black with the Fuzzies this year. The green was getting a bit old, and it's a sharp-looking car. There's no doubt about it. And the 20th and final car driver combination is the winner of the 102nd running of the Indianapolis 500, Will Power. Yeah, it was, again, another thing that was kind of an inevitability. He was going to get an Indy 500 eventually. He's one of the best drivers in the series, and again, the way this race played out was exactly the kind of Will Power race. It was a driver's race, and once he got that car out front, there wasn't a whole lot of stuff that anybody could do or say or anything to get him out of that lead spot. Yeah, what a great drive from Will Power. It was definitely a well-deserved win, though many of us in period, I guess you could say, or at least at the time, are kind of thinking, well, it's kind of a boring winner. But I think it's going to be something like a Scott Dixon win. We look back later and we'll say, well, we're glad Will Power got at least one Indy 500 win, because ultimately his career kind of deserves that win. And again, another beautiful silver Verizon car. There's not much else to say about this livery that I didn't already say in the Josef Newgarden one. Well, I certainly hope you've enjoyed this look at the 2018 IndyCar Diecast. If you did, be sure to hit the like button on it and comment for more IndyCar, motorsport, and Indy 500 content. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next video.